What would you do if your worst enemy became your only ally? A story of terror and revenge, where the line between good and evil blurs. I'll take you to the darkest corners of a small town, where a teenager found a supernatural force willing to fulfill her darkest desires. You won't be able to look away, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about what is right and what is wicked. I met a werewolf. I want to share a story for which many will judge me, and I can't say I blame them, because they have no idea what my sister and I had to endure. I encountered two distinct manifestations of evil in my life, and one of them chose to support me in fighting and eradicating the other. When the opportunity arose, I didn't hesitate for a second. I'm keeping my name and my sister's name anonymous for obvious reasons. I don't want to cause her any trouble, nor do I want it for myself. However, I believe it's fair for the world to know what happened. This happened so long ago that I can't recall the exact year, but I can say it was between 1989 and 1991. We lived in a small town, mostly surrounded by wilderness and crossed by a highway that connected the entire state. There isn't much to say about the place. People pretended to be something they weren't. A bunch of hypocrites who even gossiped about their own families. For that reason, I never got along with my cousins and rarely visited my grandparents. I never felt much love for them, or at least it faded when I learned how they had treated my mother when she first started her relationship with my father. I was 16 years old and just beginning to grasp the darkness of human nature. In my mind, I couldn't understand how others could take pleasure in hurting people who never bothered anyone. That was my case. My younger sister and I were blessed with a rare beauty for that town. However, instead of seeing it as something positive, many dedicated themselves to spreading false rumors. They claimed we weren't our father's children, but the result of a secret affair my mother had with some foreigner. Worse rumors suggested we were adopted because our father wasn't attractive enough, and our mother feared her children would be completely unattractive. For this reason, I never felt comfortable going out alone. I preferred my mother's company at all times. Growing up in such an environment made me realize I had to protect my sister at all costs, no matter what. At school, things weren't any better. It was a living hell. I had no friends, as those who approached me with friendly faces only did so to pry into my background, asking if I was really my father's daughter. Since I wouldn't give them the information they wanted, they resorted to spreading false stories. Sometimes they even hit me, but I didn't stand still. I fought back. To the teachers, I was a troublemaker, and every year they told my mother that if she didn't control me, I would be expelled. My mother knew me. She understood I wasn't anything like they said and comforted me at home. But it wasn't just the girls I had to deal with. Many boys courted me, and when I ignored or rejected them, they retaliated by hiding my backpack or my belongings. I would spend hours searching for them, and many of my school supplies ended up lost. The teachers refused to step in. However, I couldn't tolerate them doing the same to my sister. Without hesitation, I defended her, and if it meant resorting to physical fights, so be it. We both came close to being expelled from school, but we had to defend ourselves because no one else would. That's just a glimpse of the hell my sister and I lived through, and it's why I want to tell you about the days when this story began. We were walking home like any other school day. It was a Friday, and we knew we wouldn't have to worry about school until Monday. My sister and I usually finished our homework at school so we could play as much as we wanted at home or enjoy our mother's company. Despite being an adult, she had a very childlike spirit that she would let shine when the three of us were together, ready to have fun. As for my father, it was a different story. By the time I turned 16, my face was no longer that of a child and was beginning to resemble my mother's, who was only surpassed in beauty by my sister and me. Without realizing it, my father began to be influenced by the malicious comments of others. His friends didn't help much either. They would tell him he was lucky we looked like our mother and not our real father. That's how the dark days began. That Friday, we realized things wouldn't be the same anymore. When Dad came home from work, we ran to greet him with a big hug, but he didn't reciprocate. For the first time in our lives, he looked at us with disdain, and we started to feel that something was wrong. Our mother noticed it too and immediately asked him why he was treating us that way. He began accusing her of infidelity, claiming that the rumors about our parentage were true. It seemed absurd to me that he would even bring something like that up, knowing full well that my mother was still madly in love with him, just as she had been on the first day. We wanted to defend her, but she asked us to go to our room. So we did. From there, we could hear the shouts of a man who had allowed lies to poison his mind, showing that the gossip had far outweighed the love he claimed to have for his family. The argument ended decisively. Dad announced that he was going out to drink and that no one should wait up for him. My mom, a woman who disliked conflict, told him she would leave his dinner in the kitchen and that, if he wanted it warm, he could wake her up without any problem. We were already asleep when he finally came home. But the next morning, we saw that our mother had a black eye. She told us she had tripped and fallen. My younger sister didn't notice, but I did. Dad had done that to her when he came back drunk. I remember that when I saw her like that, holding back her tears, something inside me changed, as if what was once clear suddenly turned dark. When the two of us were alone, she told me not to worry, that it wouldn't happen again. But her eyes and tone of voice betrayed the lie. When Dad woke up, he greeted her with a kiss, as if nothing had happened, and did the same with us. My sister was thrilled. She loved his attention. But my heart was slowly ceasing to feel any love for a man who refused to see himself as my true father simply because I was too beautiful. That day, I spent my time reflecting on everything we were unjustly enduring. It wasn't just my sister and me anymore. Now our mother was suffering too. It wasn't fair. Things had to get better for us, or at least the people responsible for our suffering needed to face some consequences for spreading harm to the innocent without reason. From that moment on, my mindset began to shift. Gradually, I started to feel hatred toward those who made our lives unbearable. For example, the boys who always tried to flirt with me, and on some occasions tried to touch me where they shouldn't. I always threw something at them when they did. Then there were the girls who criticized us and made up stories about us so others would believe them. Because of that, no one wanted to be around us. As the days went by, my dad got worse. The abuse toward my mother became almost merciful compared to what he did to my sister and me. Without mercy, he hurt us, claiming we should never forget that he was our real father, even though we had never doubted it. Everything spiraled out of control the day he tried to do something to my sister that he shouldn't have. Her screams filled the entire street, and some neighbors had to intervene. It was a nightmare I wished would end. When things finally calmed down and my family went to sleep, I snuck out and wandered into the woods. We lived very close to it, and I just wanted to be alone, to breathe fresh air in a different environment. However, I never considered how dangerous it was to do that after midnight. I stayed lying against a tree longer than I expected, and then I heard a strange sound. It sounded like a beast feasting on its prey. Fear overwhelmed me, as I couldn't tell where it was. It wasn't until that moment that I noticed how dark the night truly was. Although I knew the way back to town, I was afraid that walking would make noise and reveal my location. Unfortunately, I didn't have to make any noise for that thing to know where I was. I heard footsteps, the crunching of branches underfoot heading in my direction, until finally I saw it face to face. It stood over 2 meters tall, with a robust and muscular build. That being was a werewolf, its muzzle dripping with blood as it chewed on flesh. It came as close to me as it could, until the stench became unbearable. I was on the verge of fainting. Tears of anguish streamed from my eyes, and my lips trembled, as did my entire body. And that's when the beast spoke. I can't describe how its voice sounded. It was very strange but understandable. It asked me why I was suffering, as if it truly cared about me. I didn't understand anything that was happening. It seemed to feel empathy for me. I had no choice but to answer, and I told it that bad things had been happening to me. After that, it asked if I had enemies, and I said yes. In response, it told me it could eliminate all of them if I wished, but only if I lured them to that area of the woods. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but one thing was clear. It didn't want to harm me. If it had, it would have done so already. I nodded, and after that, It ran off on all fours back toward the town. I noticed then that what it had been eating was a body. Whose, I had no idea. I vomited. But when I recovered, I began to wonder why it had shown such compassion for me when it didn't know me and had no reason to care. That was the great mystery I never could solve. To be honest, the first thing that came to mind was to lure someone I wanted out of my life. The first people who came to mind were those boys who harassed my sister and me at school. I'm not one to say whether they deserved such a fate or not, but they made us suffer, and it was time for things to turn in my favor. Back at school, I sought them out during recess and told them I wanted to try out a few things with them, but it had to be in the woods and in private. To make them believe me and have them eating out of my hand, I kissed two of them on the mouth. That left them stunned and evidently wanting more. Without hesitation, they all agreed to go where I told them. I admit I was terrified because if that werewolf didn't show up, it would have been the worst and most traumatic experience of my life. It must have been around 3 in the afternoon, though I'm not entirely sure. Back then, I didn't usually wear a watch. It wasn't common among students. We entered the woods. I walked ahead, leading the way. They, impatient, kept telling me to stop because we were already far enough from the town. But I didn't listen. As soon as I recognized the tree where I had sat the night before, I stopped and prayed that the werewolf would appear as quickly as possible. They began preparing themselves. I felt absolute disgust. Without a doubt, they deserved what was about to happen to them. However, as the beast took longer to arrive, I had to stall by kissing them again until I heard the crunching of branches on the ground. That was the signal that told me their time was up. I jumped back instinctively, and then the werewolf appeared, charging at the boy closest to me. It was a brutal scene. The others froze in shock as they watched their friend being torn apart in the most savage way imaginable. Soon after, they turned to look at me, and I was laughing, enjoying the scene. That's when they realized they'd been tricked and that there was no escape. The werewolf finished them off one by one, just as it had promised me. Those who tried to run away only needed a single bite to be paralyzed. Then it returned to finish the job. It showed no mercy, and I didn't expect it to. When it left the remains scattered on the ground, it approached me and asked if I would bring others. I replied yes, but in a demanding tone. I told it to be ready and not to make me wait as long as it had this time. Even I was surprised at the way I spoke to it. I think its evilness, in some way, had entered me. From that day on, I became friends with a ruthless beast that would do anything for me, eliminating anyone I chose, no exceptions. The only catch was that I had to lure the victims into the woods in that area, or at least close enough. The next victims would be the girls who had worked so hard to spread false rumors about my sister and me. However, with them, I had to be more cunning than with that group of boys. After all, they were girls and the most envious ones in the entire school. I spent 2 nights thinking about how to lure them. During that time, I was patient, taking the trouble to go into the woods to let the werewolf know I hadn't forgotten about it. Not at all. That's when the idea of how to trick them came to me. The next day, I went to school and approached them during recess. They looked at me warily, but also confused by my presence. I told them that some handsome boys were interested in them and had asked me to act as a messenger to let them know they wanted to meet them in the woods. I didn't show any nervousness or hesitation. In fact, I almost believed my own lie. Besides, I realized they were more gullible than I had imagined. More than 5 students were still missing, those whom the werewolf had sent to the afterlife. And yet, instead of being suspicious, the girls said the boys probably hadn't disappeared, but were likely preparing a place to do this or that with them. It was unbelievable that they thought that, especially when much of the town was deeply worried about the missing boys. Either way, I used their naivete to my advantage and arranged to meet them in a certain part of the woods around 2 in the afternoon. After that, I personally guided them to that area of the woods. I couldn't believe how careless the werewolf had been, leaving some remains scattered about. The smell was nearly unbearable, and they almost noticed something was off. But the beast appeared much sooner than expected. It seemed impatient or hungry. I couldn't tell exactly which. The scene was even worse this time. I don't even want to recall it now. Even I was shocked at the sheer brutality. The trees were stained red from its ruthlessness. I wanted to leave and let it eat in peace, but then it caught up to me and asked who the next ones would be. I told it clearly that those were my enemies, and now that they were gone, there was no need to bring anyone else. That's when it said it usually fed on livestock and rarely preyed on humans, but it wanted one more human before returning to eating animals. It looked me in the eye and, without hesitation, demanded that I bring it my father immediately. I suddenly remembered that I'd forgotten about him. I couldn't understand how he hadn't been my first choice. More than a request or an order, it felt like a suggestion, and without a second thought, I told it I would do it. I went home, and when he returned from work, I acted very affectionate, as if my love for him had suddenly rekindled. That wretch thought I would forget all the times he had tried to take advantage of me and my sister, or the abuse he had inflicted on the three of us. His life insurance would provide us with a substantial sum of money, so it seemed like a good idea to send him to the afterlife. When the weekend arrived, I convinced him to go for a walk. But that wasn't enough to get him into the woods, so I took a risk. I told him I wanted to do something immoral with him, and I waited nervously for his response. Just as I expected, without hesitation, he said yes. I insisted it had to be in the woods, and took his hand to lead him. I had no doubt he was thrilled about what he thought was going to happen. As soon as we reached the tree, I stopped and turned to look him straight in the eye. I told him his time had come to pay. The werewolf appeared and lunged at him, plunging him into unimaginable agony with its claws and fangs. Without any sense of revulsion, I told the beast it needed to leave his face intact and make sure his remains would be found. Only that way would his death be confirmed, and I could handle the insurance paperwork. Evil had already consumed me, and I didn't care. As I had planned, the money became ours, along with a pension he had secretly hidden even from our mother. Our days of happiness and peace began, and the werewolf dealt with anyone who dared utter a single word against us. It wasn't even necessary for me to lure them to the woods anymore because the beast started going directly to the homes of those I pointed out. I remained its friend for many years. Even after I became a professional, I would visit it every so often. Until one day, I went to see it, and instead of finding the beast, I found the body of an old man, covered in red blotches but without a single wound. That was him, the man who had granted my most inhuman wishes. I buried him myself, and despite his evil nature, I thanked him. Yet I was never able to discover why he had spared my life that night, or worse, why he had chosen to help me eliminate so many wicked people along the way.